Few are quite as tenured for the job of discussing a third game in a popular co-op FPS franchise that hasn't lived up to fan expectations as myself, whilst also being grossly underqualified to talk about Killing Floor specifically. As you might have heard, Killing Floor 3 released on Thursday last week, and I've been getting pangs of deja vu ever since that date was pushed back 4 months following a torrid beta reception in March. I have a very limited history with this game franchise, only really being aware of it in the same breath as Payday the Heist back during the days of the first content houses, as the original was one of those titles that Creatures played. So, upon hearing even more damning rumours of the game potentially being cobbled together from the remnants of a failed extraction shooter, and being aware of the many similarities to Payday, a franchise I have an extensive history with, morbid curiosity took over, and I had to take a look. Hoping beyond hope that we wouldn't have another Payday 3 on our hands. I know there's a hell of a lot of fan overlap there, and quite frankly, we've suffered enough recently. And I'm genuinely shocked to be saying this, given how much bad press Killing Floor 3 has received up until launch, but I had fun. It's an undoubtedly flawed game, developed by a team that's putting out all manner of fires at the moment, but as an outsider to the series, relying mostly on genre familiarity to get by, I had, and continue to have, a more than passable time playing this game, clocking in roughly 20 hours over the first weekend since launch. I say all of this from the perspective of someone with very little skin in the game. I didn't play Killing Floor 1 or 2, my only experience with those titles is from the outside looking in, which undoubtedly makes me less qualified to talk about certain elements of the experience than others, but it does also give me a somewhat unique perspective. For one, it's opened my eyes to the die-hard fans of Payday 3 who were newcomers to the franchise and just couldn't wrap their heads around why as series vets are so damn pessimistic all the time. It's a matter of perspective, expectations, and to some extent nostalgia, in a world where games, especially these safe franchise darlings, are moving in a more homogenized direction, and I'm honestly finding it fascinating sitting here on the other side of the fence this time. To be clear, this isn't a defense of Killing Floor 3. I appreciate many of the issues fans have with what are undoubtedly regressions from the old formula. Hell, I've run into many of the same issues without even realising they were taking steps in the wrong direction for the third installment. But it is somewhat of a study into how the modern game franchise gets you, who it aims to appeal to, and why I don't think this is sustainable in the slightest, despite being one of those contrarians on the Steam review page saying I'm having fun. This goes for all media really. We're constantly bombarded with sequels, crossovers, and successful one-offs turned into franchises, regardless of whether they've already told the story they intended to. It's investor-friendly, risk-minimizing behaviour. But beyond that, the worrying trend is the watering down of these incessant sequels. There's a familiarity to this game for anyone who's played any number of modern first-person PvE shooters. Your COD zombies, your Dooms, and that all likely serves to frustrate fans of the first two games, as the charm has undoubtedly been chipped away at in order to make 3 more familiar and easy to pick up for newcomers such as myself. The outcome seems to be these ultra-palatable, shiny experiences that play like they were made on an assembly line, designed to feel familiar by cannibalizing game concepts and mechanics that happen to be flavour of the month, no matter how well they fit into the game's core loop. We received overkill weapons in Payday 3, now it's gadgets in Killing Floor 3, effectively the character ults that have been popularised by MOBAs and competitive FPS games such as Overwatch. I don't necessarily have an issue with how they're designed or implemented. This is more of an observation of the loss of individualism that gave these games a platform to outperform their competitors and make it to this franchise-worthy status in the first place. Killing Floor 3 is undoubtedly an amalgamation of popular modern titles. Its movement, gunplay, and grey futuristic aesthetic all feel borrowed from somewhere else, and as a UE5 game it runs into those performance issues that seem par for the course with this engine. Not to mention that weirdly clean, instantly familiar modern UE feel that always seems to sacrifice any sense of artistic vision for ease of presentation and functionality. One of the core complaints I see online is that the game lacks the soul of its predecessors, and I can certainly vouch for that, especially as someone who's experienced Payday losing an element of what made it intangibly special in recent years. All the horror, suspense, and even the gallows humour us Brits are so known for seems to have dissipated in Killing Floor 3 in favour of a wider cast of characters who feel too quippy to be believable and detract from the tension constantly. The maps are also fairly uninteresting to look at, with a few standout locations that juxtapose a tendency towards creating grey, semi-futuristic, vaguely sciencey settings. You can't really criticise the game's graphical fidelity, but that also comes at the cost of performance on more mid-tier rigs, passively restricting their returning player base as we saw with Payday 3. I think the map layout's strong though and designed with the new mobility systems in mind. I don't find myself lamenting a lack of maps at launch as I was when Payday 3 released with just 8 short heists. It's just another feature that feels like a step backwards, not in terms of gameplay, but in clarity of design and tone. You could easily slot sections of these into any generic competitive multiplayer title and not bat an eyelid. The same is true of the Z designs. In terms of their gameplay purpose, there's a nice balance in how they function within the hordes, but whilst they look visually imposing and impressive, a key element of that very human body horror from the earlier games has disappeared in favour of edgier, more mechanical designs and very stiff animations. Now, in the heat of battle, you won't always notice these complaints. This is what Killing Floor 3 continues to get right. The moment-to-moment experience, mid-wave, either solo or in a group, is engaging. I've enjoyed using most weapons I've tried out so far, although have admittedly defaulted to Mr. Foster and his AR-focused playstyle, given I'm drawn to the allure of my fellow countryman and his cricket-related quips that me and about 10 other players will get. Where I've criticised the overall design of the Zeds, I have to equally praise the death and damage animations. Much like how the flying helmets in Payday offer a tangible satisfaction when shooting them, I don't think I'm going to ever get bored of popping heads here. This ramps up even further with a really well-weighted melee system used to perfection in the ninja's kit, enabling you to rip and tear through hordes in satisfying blood showers. The elephant in the room here is obviously how these perk kits and playstyles are tied to individual operators, an immensely unpopular decision that was met with enough derisive feedback Tripwire intends to uncouple them in an upcoming update. But again, this leaves me questioning development timelines and the extent of publisher pressure. Surely you'd go out of your way to revert a unanimously reviled design prior to launch if given the time, so this might help give some perspective on the Embracer Group oversight I'll speak on further shortly. Regardless, the music and general audio design is also generally excellent, covering up some of the most irritating voice work and driving the gameplay forward. The game currently offers just 3 difficulties, with normal being a bit slow paced in my experience, but hard actually offering a reasonable challenge, so much so it felt like quite a leap at first. Hell on Earth is a difficulty I've yet to explore without any fully leveled skill trees, but I do look forward to the potential challenge as Killing Floor 3 does awaken that desire in me to get good, a positive sign in terms of long-term replayability. Unfortunately, despite offering 6-player co-op, a cut above the usual 4, leading to some truly messy gameplay moments, more often than not, it feels like 6 players all having their own single-player experience. Resource sharing is an afterthought, and unless you're running medic weaponry specifically, you'll seldom think about your teammates' needs and positioning. The syringe is now a limited use mechanic that can only be used to regenerate your own health, a curious design decision that only leads to frustration and limits team play. I also really dislike the boss fights as they currently stand. They often boil down to DPS races, pairing gargantuan health pools with limited and clunky mechanics that feel like they take most strategy out of the game. I believe these enemy types will be better off dispersed through regular rounds instead of being janky showpieces that damage the pacing of a run. Not to mention, with how rewards work in this game, if you go down at some point, you're often left spectating some poor bloke getting chased around by 3 gorillas for the best part of 5 minutes, when it's obvious to everyone but him that this attempt is doomed. It wouldn't take much to vastly improve these sections, which again screams unfinished. In fact, the rigid way in which the entire survival mode is structured is another oddity. 5 fixed waves and a boss fight is currently the only way to play. Round modifiers offer a little variety, but not being able to dictate game length feels like a really peculiar and frankly arbitrary decision on the part of the devs. Too much of a time commitment to load up casually, too short to enjoy more expensive weapon setups for any real length of time. Still, there's enough to this 5-round formula to keep me reasonably engaged, especially with relatively robust ways to progress your account. You'll be earning perk XP leveling up your character, locating resources to craft and upgrade attachments, with an element of passive RNG associated, perk proficiency to upgrade skills and the overall performance of that class, as well as the dreaded Battle Pass XP. Additional challenges support this leveling system, giving you more discrete objectives to focus on, as well as an overarching narrative you can follow throughout the levels, giving minor insights into the story of the game. These are easy to track and satisfying enough to complete. The attached progression systems, however, are all over the place in terms of how finished they feel. The attachment system undoubtedly has potential, but I can see it being quite polarizing as a fairly transparent attempt to drag out weapon progression. Skills are okay, there isn't a great deal of build variety on offer, and many of the most interesting passive options will only unlock after tens of hours of playing that class. Some of my favourite skills, such as Hothead for Commando, providing an occasional AoE effect upon headshot kill, are paired next to uninteresting yet meta-defining adjustments such as reduced weapon cost from the pod, speaking to the fact that granular, pure statistical improvements end up coming out on top over potentially playstyle defining options, which is a shame. Tying other skills to your throwables and gadgets also has a slightly limiting effect on the scope of RPG mechanics. This all ties back to designing the game around these fixed perk playstyles. Still, being able to gradually upgrade skills is an interesting twist that expands the scope for replayability and build crafting. I do believe your perks level up a little too slowly, especially bearing in mind these additional systems supporting replayability, but never felt unrewarded for taking on a mission. Of course, the elephant in the room are these Helldivers style battle passes, trading out FOMO for a more palatable approach to cosmetic slinging. They are incredibly forgiving in terms of playtime commitment to complete, but I and many others fundamentally don't enjoy seeing this thinly veiled sales mechanic in my games. I understand they intend to add content updates free of charge and support development costs in this way, but it's always going to be a system resisted by the older generation of players who I find myself identifying with more and more these days. If that isn't enough to get the stomach acid churning, the microtransaction store will be though, selling nostalgia out of the gate in the form of a classic Mr. Foster luck for $20, with bundles of premium currency naturally selling in awkward quantities, economic psychological manipulation at its grimiest. But what can you expect from a game published by a studio owned by bleeding Swedish giant Embracer Group? After overextending its M&A strategy during COVID, the company has been on a bit of a death spiral ever since, gasping for air by pushing games to market as quickly as possible. Embracer also owns Plaion, launch publishers of Payday 3, who had plans for a similar MTX store prior to its disastrous server incident on release, backtracking to save face in the wake of a torrent of negative press. It's simply how they do business, and they will aim to get away with as much as they can within this store over time. And this is really where my greatest concerns for the game lie. So many of the issues the community appears to have with the game stem from this being a cash grab by association. That lack of soul, shoddy presentation, and trend chasing, it's the Embracer MO. The delay was a positive sign that self-interest could be put on hold, but 4 months was clearly not enough time if they're still pushing major gameplay adjustments back into the roadmap. I fear for how they'll handle it moving forward, especially once the trackable Steam player numbers start falling into the single thousands and the dead game accusations start flying around, as they inevitably will. A few miscellaneous bits for me to touch on before closing off this video. The world building around the actual Zeds is fascinating, although the way the narrative is told gets lost almost immediately. Obviously, it's a character-driven game for the most part, much like Payday, but with a cast of surprisingly sandpaper-adjacent crewmates, there's not much about this world that'll actually hook its claws into you, unless you take the time to read all those codex descriptions. Speaking of which, this is also where you can look into key details related to elemental weaknesses. Whilst there is a logic behind it, with flesh burning, metal corroding, etc., these damage types often feel a bit arbitrary. It's an almost Monster Hunter-light system, but seeing as you're effectively going to be dealing with every single weakness and resistance every match, what your weapon and playstyle is weak or strong against ends up being a bit of an afterthought. If it was easier to change damage types on the fly, I'd see the vision, but in truth, I imagine this is something that only the most dedicated players will end up interacting with. The hideout is also a little disappointing. It's a glorified walkable menu with the only real mechanical value being this bare-bones shooting range. To make matters worse, needing to wander up to the VTOL before every mission feels like a poor substitute for a ready up button, but that's a simple nitpick. Finally, I've run into my fair share of bugs, especially when playing online, where things do get a little jankier. Permanently floating bodies, 7-player lobbies, and crashes immediately after an intense boss fight will frustrate you and take you out of the action, but nothing pisses me off quite like Zed spawning outside the playable space and hard crashes voiding any rewards. So with almost all of the points I've discussed here being net negatives, why did I open this video by telling you I've been enjoying my time with the game? Well, it's probably for the very same reasons that hold it back from being anything more than a 7 out of 10. It's so accessible, picking it up was like riding a bike. The gunplay, whilst nothing special, can be punchy at times, and melee in particular is satisfying. Solid gore and death animations make simply joining a lobby and clicking on heads feel good. With no objectives beyond staying alive and killing efficiently, it's become a game I turn on to switch off and play without giving it all too much thought. Which is not how you produce a classic, but is how you go some way towards making an unoffensive, low-stakes financial success, which is in and of itself a slightly damning reflection of what the industry is settling for right now. I am a tourist here, and this game is appealing to me specifically. There is every chance I'll be gone within a month, whilst your ride and die fans won't necessarily be back to replace me. Killing Floor 3 is not the finished article. It has room to grow and get better, and likely will with a relatively promising roadmap which you can see on screen now. But the solid foundation argument leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. I said all this about Payday 3 in September 2023, and whilst Killing Floor 3's launch has been infinitely better from a technical perspective, games shouldn't be releasing as just good foundations. That's what early access is for. Pretending to be anything else is disingenuous, and the live service moniker is rapidly evolving into an excuse for not releasing complete games and monetizing unfinished products. Killing Floor 3 has earned this mixed reception. However, I sense something a little more insidious bubbling under the surface when I read reviews from fans comparing it to previous games in the franchise. I see a desire to watch it burn under the pretense that this will wake Tripwire up to eventually return to form. Sadly, I've seen this cycle before. There is no redemption. If it burns, it'll burn for good. The team will be squeezed and eventually shrunk down to the point of non-existence. I know this game has all the live service trappings of something produced by a studio in Tripwire that's getting its arm twisted behind its back by Embracer, but we've seen how willing they are to cut those losses before. It doesn't have a happy ending, so I need to warn against despising and disparaging those who choose to play the game out of sheer malice. Unfortunately, this is the state of the market at this point. The disconnect between players and developers widens, and we end up with products like this, a game that myself and thousands of others can undoubtedly enjoy, but also one that could never spark a franchise as Killing Floor 1 did some 16 years ago. It's something I've mused over in the years following Payday 3's launch. These games, the way the industry is producing them, stand on the shoulders of giants that came first. I wouldn't be making this video if the reputation of Killing Floor hadn't encouraged me to take a punt on a £35 game, and all these studios are banking on that fact. It's why we're seeing so many disappointing sequels, whilst the Game of the Year contenders are all either brand new titles or enigmas made by auteurs such as Hideo Kojima. These franchises need to start tapping into what made them unique in the first place. That's the driving force behind their sustained existence, and failing to understand that lightning in a bottle is causing untold damage and alienating fans. The alternative is that a fourth game is simply never going to see the light of day, and that Curse of 3 will start to look like more than just a silly superstition. Killing Floor 3 is an aggressively decent game, sickly inoffensive and paint by numbers, desperately in need of something that looks like a risk to differentiate itself and avoid the current fate of Payday 3. Further evidence that there's a reason Valve seems consistently content ending its game's legacy at number 2. Thank you so much for watching. This situation is simply too familiar to us Payday fans for me to ignore, and I hope I've done some justice explaining how I feel about this game as someone who's now lived both sides of the argument. More than anything, I just hope fans of Killing Floor get to enjoy their franchise for years to come. If trying and somewhat enjoying Killing Floor 3 has taught me anything, it's that I bloody well should be going back to better understand its roots from the first 2 games. Thanks again, take care, and I'll see you all in the next video. A huge thank you to my dedicated Patreon backers. If you want to join this crew in going infamous, check out the link below and pledge as little as $2 to see your name in the credits, or get 24-hour early access to future videos and vote on upcoming content. Take care, I'll see you all soon.